She was 54 years old, 11 days out of a marriage that had lasted 29 years, and she had $2,847 in a checking account that her attorney had called a fair division of liquid assets. She had a 2011 Subaru Forester with a cracked rear taillight, a storage unit in Bowling Green, Kentucky, full of furniture that didn't belong anywhere anymore, and a single cardboard box on the passenger seat containing a Bible, 2 framed photographs, and a ceramic rooster her mother had kept on the kitchen windowsill for 40 years. That was the whole of it. That was what remained after 29 years of building something with another person, and with most of that money already gone to filing fees and first and last month's rent on an apartment she had ultimately walked away from. She drove 6 hours east into the hill country of eastern Tennessee and used the last of what she had to buy an abandoned gristmill on a creek road in a hollow called Sycamore Bend for $350 because it was the only thing left in the world that still felt like it belonged to her. The roof had been missing 3 sections of tin since 2009. The millstone had cracked down the center and neither half had moved in decades. The county assessor had listed the property as structurally compromised, value negligible. Her sister called it a folly. Her sister's husband called it worse. But what none of them knew, including Evelyn herself, was that behind the stone wall of the old grain loft, sealed inside a tin lockbox that had not been opened in 47 years, was something that would rewrite everything she thought she understood about her own life. Before we go any further, if stories like this one mean something to you, hit that subscribe button right now. And drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from tonight. These stories travel further than we ever expect, and we love knowing where they land. Evelyn Ruth Marsh had been moving toward that mill her whole life without knowing it. She was born in 1970 in Cookeville, Tennessee, the second of 3 daughters of a man named Harold Marsh, who sold farm equipment, and a woman named Doris, who gave piano lessons out of the front room and made the best sweet potato pie in Putnam County, and was never once credited for either. Evelyn grew up in a yellow house on a gravel road with a vegetable garden that her mother kept with the seriousness of a vocation. She learned to put up tomatoes before she learned long division. She learned that if you wanted something done, you did it yourself, and if you wanted something to last, you put it in a jar and sealed it tight. She went to Tennessee Tech on a partial scholarship in 1988 and studied accounting because her father said it was practical. And Evelyn at 18 was the kind of girl who still believed her father about what was practical. She met Douglas Whitfield in her junior year at a bonfire out at Center Hill Lake. He was studying civil engineering, tall and easy-walking, with the kind of confidence that looks like warmth until you've lived with it for 20 years and understand it was always only ever about him. They married in 1995. She was 25. She had just passed her CPA exam. She had been accepted into a graduate program in financial management at Vanderbilt. Douglas had a job offer in Bowling Green that he said was the opportunity of a lifetime. And he needed her income to carry them through the first 2 years while he established himself. She deferred the program for 1 year, then another. Then she stopped thinking about it. The way you stop thinking about a window you've painted shut. You know it's there, but you stop expecting it to open. They had 1 son, Marcus, who was 26 now and lived in Portland and called every other Sunday and meant well in the way of children who love you, but have built a life that doesn't have much room for the weight of what you carry. There were good years inside those 29. She didn't pretend there weren't. But there is a kind of good year that is good because you have managed it into being through your own effort, through your own softening of sharp edges and swallowing of hard things. And those years, when they're done, leave a woman more tired than she has words for. Douglas told her on a Thursday in March. He'd come home early, which should have been the first sign because Douglas Whitfield had not come home early once in 11 years. He stood in the kitchen while she was making chicken soup, and he said he wanted to talk. He said he had been unhappy for a long time. He said he had grown in a direction she hadn't, and he used that phrase, grown in a direction, with the solemnity of a man who had been practicing it in his car. He said her name was Rebecca. She was 31. She worked in his firm's Charlotte office. Evelyn turned off the stove. She put the lid on the pot. She dried her hands on the dish towel with the blue stripe that she had bought at a farmer's market in Murfreesboro in 2014 and had washed so many times it had gone soft as old skin. Then she looked at Douglas Whitfield for a long moment. She had known. Not the specifics, not the name or the city or the firm, but the shape of it she had known. There is a particular silence between two people that is not peace. She had been living inside that silence for 2 years and had chosen to call it something else. Because choosing to call it something else is how you survive until you're ready to stop surviving and start deciding. She said, "I want you out by Sunday." He was. The attorney was efficient. The house had been in Douglas's name before the wedding, an inheritance from his mother. Her own retirement account, which she had funded out of a bookkeeping salary that was 1/3 of what Douglas earned, was modest. The settlement was legally sound. It was, her attorney said, equitable. Evelyn sat in the parking lot outside the attorney's office in Bowling Green on a Wednesday afternoon in April and did not cry. She just sat there for a while, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, watching a sparrow work at something caught in the gutter of the building across the street. Then she remembered Sycamore Bend. Her grandmother Nell, her mother's mother, had been born in a hollow in eastern Tennessee called Sycamore Bend. The family had sold off the land in pieces over the decades, but there was one parcel that had never sold, an old gristmill property on Sycamore Creek, because no one had ever been able to agree on what to do with it, and eventually the county had taken it for back taxes. Evelyn had driven through Sycamore Bend exactly twice in her life, both times as a child in the back seat of her mother's Buick, watching the hills go dark in the late afternoon. She had forgotten about it for 30 years. She remembered it now. She drove out the following Saturday, 5.5 hours, east on the interstate then north, on increasingly narrow roads that wound up into the Cumberland Plateau where the hardwood forests crowded the shoulders, and the creek crossings had no guardrails. She passed through a town called Millsford, with a post office and a dollar store and a church with a marquee sign that read, "God doesn't call the equipped, he equips the cowed." She wasn't sure she believed that, but she wrote it in her head anyway. Sycamore Bend was less a town than a settled understanding between a handful of families and a stretch of creek. There was a combination bait shop and hardware store run by a man everyone called Peck. There was a volunteer fire station. There was a Baptist church that looked like it had been built in 1890 and painted in 1951 and left alone since. The road through the hollow followed Sycamore Creek, and the creek was running clear and cold off the plateau, and the sound of it was the first thing in 6 weeks that made Evelyn's shoulders come down. She found the mill at the end of a gravel track off the main road, tucked in where the creek bent hard around a limestone outcropping. The building was old-growth chestnut timber, post and beam, 2 stories with a stone foundation that had not moved in 100 years, even if everything above it had started to. The overshot wheel on the east wall was still there, the wooden paddles rotted to stubs but the iron axle intact. The creek ran fast past the wheel race, making a sound that was somewhere between a conversation and a song. Evelyn stood there for a long time with the engine running and both hands on the steering wheel. Then she shut the car off and got out. The county assessor's office was in Millsford. The woman at the counter, whose name tag said Donna, and who wore a reading glasses chain with small amber beads, looked up the parcel without being asked twice. The Sycamore Bend mill. Yeah, listed for years. Nobody wants the liability. Foundation's sound, but the roof's gone in 3 places, and the upper loft floor might not hold a grown adult. Currently listed as for $350 with a $20 transfer fee. $350, Evelyn said. That's what it says. Donna confirmed in the tone of a woman who had repeated improbable things behind a government counter for many years without finding them any less improbable. Evelyn wrote a check for $370. Donna stamped and dated and slid a deed transfer and a single iron key across the laminate countertop. The key was old, long-shanked, the kind that belonged to a door that still meant business. "Good luck with it," Donna said. Evelyn took the key. It was cold from sitting in the county's possession for years. It warmed in her hand on the drive back to Sycamore Bend. The lock on the mill door was iron and stiff, but it turned. The door swung in on darkness and the smell of old wood and creek damp and stone, and something underneath those things, something mineral and dry like the inside of the earth, was exhaling. She stepped in. The afternoon light came through the gaps in the roof and fell in columns across the plank floor, and the stone grinding platform, and the long silent machinery. Dust moved in the light like it had been waiting for company. She stood in the middle of that room for 5 full minutes without moving. Then she sat down on the stone edge of the grinding platform and put her face in her hands and said, out loud to no one, "All right, what do we do now?" It was not a question. It was the beginning of something. She drove back to Cookville that night, slept in her sister's guest room, and was back in Sycamore Bend by 7 the following morning with a push broom, a pair of work gloves, 2 gallons of drinking water, and a Coleman lantern from the hardware store in Millsford. Peck at the bait shop had sold her the lantern without comment, though he'd given her a look that said he had questions he was too polite to ask. She started with the ground floor. She swept the main room, which took 3 hours. She cleared out the nests, a family of squirrels in the northeast corner, evidence of raccoons near the old grain chute, a community of mud daubers above the south window. She wiped down the machinery with dry rags. She found on a wooden peg beside the door an apron. Canvas faded green, enormous, the kind a person wore when they meant to work. It had been there long enough that the canvas had stiffened and the ties had grown brittle. But it was still there. She took it down and held it. Somebody had worked here. Somebody had come in every morning and put on this apron and worked. She put it back on the peg. On the 3rd day, she climbed the interior stairs to the grain loft. The stairs held her. The loft floor creaked in 2 places but didn't give. The loft ran the full length of the building, low-ceilinged, lit by a single window on the north wall, and it smelled of old grain, a warm, dusty sweetness that was almost like bread. Along the east wall, built into the stone itself, were a series of wooden shelving units, hand-cut, mortise and tenon, the work of someone who had understood joinery. On the shelves were mason jars. Dozens and dozens of mason jars, each one sealed and labeled in handwriting so small and careful it looked like embroidery. Pickled green beans, apple butter, chow-chow, elderberry jam, corn relish. The labels included names for the Ledford family. Christmas 1961. For Mina Pryor, new baby, July 1959. For the Garvey boys after the flood, March 1963. Evelyn stood in front of those shelves for a long time. The jars were 50-60 years old. The food inside was long past, but the labels were still legible, every one of them, and every one of them was for someone. Not one jar was labeled for the maker, not one. She went back to Millsford that evening and stopped at the hardware store. Peck was sweeping up. She asked him, who had run the Sycamore Bend mill. Peck stopped sweeping. He thought for a moment. That would have been the Renfrew family, he said. Odell Renfrew ran it from maybe the 30s until it shut down in the late 60s. His wife Violet ran it before that, when Odell was away in the war. But the one people really remembered, Peck leaned on his broom, was their daughter, Hester. Hester Renfrew. She took over from her father in about 1955 and ran it until she passed in 1973. 62 years old. Unmarried. No children. Folks said she knew every family in the hollow, knew what they needed before they asked. She would grind your corn on credit and forgive the credit when she knew you couldn't pay. She kept bees. She put up food for people in hard winters. She lived in the room above the mill. Evelyn said, "There's a room above the loft?" Peck looked at her. "You didn't go all the way up?" There was a second stair, narrow, almost a ladder. At the far end of the loft behind a board door she had taken for a section of wall. Behind it was a small room, no more than 12 feet square, with a single window looking out over the creek, and a narrow iron bed frame still against the wall, and a wood stove in the corner, and on the floor beside the stove, a wooden crate that had been there long enough that the floor had discolored in a square around it. Inside the crate, a tin lockbox, padlocked. Evelyn looked at the key in her hand, the long iron key from the county assessor's office. She had not tried it on anything but the front door. She held it to the padlock. She turned it. The padlock opened. Inside the tin box were not letters. Not yet, though letters would come. What she found first was a ledger. Small, narrow, covered in cloth the color of old mustard, every page filled in the same deliberate hand she had seen on the mason jar labels. The cover had no title. She opened to the first page. At the top, in ink that had faded to the color of dried leaves, someone had written, "What I have done for people in this hollow. So I remember and do not lose count." The first entry was dated May 1955. Lyle and Greta Hooper. Corn ground on credit, 40 pounds. They lost the bottom field to flooding. Will not ask for payment. Then Bertie Kinlaw, July 1955. Her husband passed in June. I gave her 6 jars of bean relish and 2 gallons of honey. She tried to pay me with a handkerchief her mother had embroidered. I said no. I said, "Keep the handkerchief." Then the Sutherland children, December 1955, both parents down with fever. I carried food up the Ridge Road every morning for 9 days. Did not tell anyone because they are proud people. Evelyn sat down on the floor of that small room with the ledger in her lap and the Coleman lantern at her side, and read until the lantern needed fuel. She did not sleep much that night. She lay in the small room, She had started sleeping there on the iron bed frame with her sleeping bag, because it felt wrong to drive away, like leaving a conversation mid-sentence, and she thought about Hester Renfrew, a woman who had never married, who had inherited a mill and run it alone for 18 years and never once, based on that ledger, done a single thing for the purpose of being seen doing it. Every entry was a quiet transaction between herself and the back of a notebook. I did this. I will not lose count. If you're still with us, we want you to stay. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Because what Evelyn found in that box would take months to understand and a lifetime to carry. Over the next 2 weeks, Evelyn went through the rest of what was in the crate. There were 4 composition books beneath the ledger, filled with something between a diary and a record. Hester had not been a woman who trafficked in sentiment. She wrote about the hollow the way a naturalist writes about a field. Closely, accurately, with the attention of someone who understands that if you don't write it down, it disappears. She noted the flood years and the drought years, and who in the hollow had managed, and who had not, and what she had done about it. She noted deaths and births and the names of the babies as they were given to her through the mill house window, when mothers stopped by to grind corn and show her their children. But in the second composition book, in the spring entries of 1944, the writing changed. It became briefly warm in a way the rest of it was not. April 18, 1944, a letter from Edmund today, and then the next line. He sounds like himself. That Edmund Caulfield. His name appeared throughout that spring. Edmund, who had grown up 2 hollers over and had been in Hester's class in the one-room school at the bottom of the road, who had been shipped to the Pacific Theater in 1943, and wrote to Hester in letters she had kept tied in a bundle at the bottom of the tin box beneath the ledger. There were 31 letters. Evelyn read every one. Edmund wrote the way people write when they are not trying to be eloquent and end up being more eloquent than they know. He described the islands. He described what the water looked like at 4 in the morning. He described the smell of certain flowers that had no English name, and the way some of the men in his unit talked about home. The way you would talk about something you were no longer sure you'd see again, carefully, not wanting to wear it out. He wrote about Hester. He wrote, "When I try to think of what I'm here for, I think of the hollow. I think of your family's mill. I think of a life that is useful rather than important. I would like to have that life. I would like to have it with you." The last letter was dated November 1944. There were no more letters after November 1944. Evelyn went back to Peck's hardware store. She described Edmund Caulfield. Peck was quiet for a moment. His father knew the Caulfields, he said. Edmund didn't come. Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 44. Evelyn stood in the hardware store with the bundle of 31 letters in her hands and understood something about Hester Renfrew that the ledger hadn't told her and couldn't have. That the woman who had spent 18 years putting up food for sick neighbors and grinding corn on credit for flooded families and carrying provisions up ridge roads in winter. That woman had done all of it in the years after Edmund. That all of that giving had happened on the other side of a loss that Hester had never described and never discussed, and had recorded only in 31 letters in a tin box that she apparently never expected anyone to open. That is a different kind of strength than people talk about when they talk about strength. Evelyn drove back to the mill and sat on the limestone outcropping over the creek for a long time. She thought about Douglas. She thought about 29 years. She thought about the things she had set aside and the things she had swallowed, and all the time she had told herself that she was fine, that it was fine. That fine was good enough for a woman with a son in Portland, and a house with a vegetable garden, and a marriage that was, on paper, equitable. Hester Renfrew had not had 29 years. She had had a handful of letters, and she had not spent the years after Edmund being fine. She had spent them being useful. The distinction, sitting on that cold limestone with the creek running loud below her, hit Evelyn like something she had needed to hear for a long time. She started making calls the next week. The Sycamore Bend mill was not on any historic register. It wasn't famous. It wasn't the subject of any article or documentary. Hester Renfrew was not in any archive that Evelyn could find with 3 hours and a library computer in Millsford. She was simply a woman who had run a mill and kept bees and put up food for people, and then died at 62 and left behind a tin box that nobody had opened. Evelyn was going to open it all the way. She contacted the County Historical Society. She spoke to the director, a retired schoolteacher named Lou Ann Becker, who met her at the mill on a Tuesday morning and stood in the grain loft for a long time not saying anything. Then she said, "I've been in this county my whole life. I never knew about her." They began together. Lou Ann brought in a local historian from the University Extension in Cookeville. Evelyn began making calls to families she found in Hester's composition books. The Hoopers, the Kinlaws, the Sutherlands. Some of the families were gone from the Hollow. Some had children still in the county. Some had grandchildren in other states who answered the phone, with the polite wariness of people who don't expect good news from area codes they don't recognize. But when Evelyn explained who Hester Renfrew was, and what she had done, and what she had found in the tin box, the wariness gave way to something else. The calls got long. People started to remember. My grandmother talked about a woman at the mill. My mother kept a jar of honey with a green label. I don't know why I kept it. I just couldn't throw it away. My grandfather says there was a woman up in Sycamore Bend who made sure nobody went hungry in '58. I never knew her name. The name was Hester Renfrew. That was also when Conrad Beaumont showed up. He drove up Sycamore Bend Road on a Friday morning in a silver Lexus with Tennessee dealer plates. He was 60 years old, trim, with a real estate developer's handshake and a smile that was accustomed to closing things. He had heard about the mill property through the county assessor's office. Apparently, unusual property transfers in small counties travel fast among people who track them. He said he represented a hospitality group with properties in Gatlinburg and Townsend and Pigeon Forge, and that the Sycamore Bend corridor had real potential for a boutique eco-resort concept. Creek frontage, timber aesthetic, the old mill as an event venue. He offered Evelyn $220,000, cash, 60 days to close. He said it the way people say numbers when they expect the number to end the conversation. Evelyn looked at him for a moment. She thought about the $847 that was left in her checking account after 2 months of groceries and propane, and a new section of roof tin that a local man named Burl Tatum had put on for her at cost, because he said his grandmother had been one of Hester's neighbors and it was the least he could do. She thought about $220,000. What that would mean, never worrying again, a real home. Something like security finally, at 54. She said, "Can I ask you something, Mr. Beaumont? What would you do with the upper room?" He didn't know there was an upper room. She described it. He shrugged. "We'd gut the interior and work with a designer. It's the bones we're buying. The creek, the timber frame, the wheel." She nodded slowly. "I'll think about it," she said. She gave herself a week. The week was not easy. She did the math every night. She called her sister. Her sister said, "Evelyn, take the money, please. You're living in a mill." She called Marcus in Portland. Marcus said, "Mom, I just want you to be okay." Neither of them were wrong. She was 54 years old, alone in a hollow in eastern Tennessee, sleeping on an iron bed frame, and $847 was not a number that offered comfort. On the 5th night, she went back through the tin box. She had been through it several times by then, but she went through it again slowly. The ledger, the composition books, the letters from Edmund. At the bottom of the box, tucked under the letters, was something she had overlooked before. A single sheet of paper, folded in thirds, written in a different hand than Hester's. Older, larger, ink gone pale as ash. It was dated 1971. It was from Hester's mother, Violet. "My dear girl, if you're reading this, then I've been gone a while, and you're still here doing what you do. I want you to know that I have watched you every year since Edmund, and I have never once felt sorry for you. Not because your grief was small, it was not, but because you turned it into something that fed people. You turned it into something that mattered. Don't let anyone tell you a life like yours was a small life. It was the largest life I ever saw up close." Evelyn sat with that letter for a long time. Then she called Conrad Beaumont in the morning. She said, "I appreciate the offer, but I'm not selling. I'm going to tell you why." She told him about Hester, about the ledger, about Violet's letter, about the mason jars labeled for people in the hollow, and the letters from Edmund that Hester had kept for 30 years, and the composition books where she had recorded the life of a hollow that would otherwise have gone unwritten. Beaumont listened. He was a professional. He listened carefully, and then he said, "Miss Marsh, I understand you feel a connection to this property, but you bought it for $350. I'm offering you 600 times that. I'd encourage you to separate sentiment from financial reality." "I appreciate that," Evelyn said. "Goodbye, Mr. Beaumont." She hung up. Her hands were shaking. She sat down on the stone grinding platform with her hands in her lap and breathed until they stopped. Then she got up and went to work. Lou Ann Becker at the Historical Society filed a nomination with the Tennessee Historical Commission. A local attorney named James Albright, who was the grandson of one of the families in Hester's composition books, and who said he'd been looking for a reason to do something for Sycamore Bend for 20 years, handled the paperwork pro bono. The nomination moved through the commission in 7 months. The Sycamore Bend Mill was listed on the Tennessee Register of Historic Places the following spring. A state designation followed 18 months after that. Conrad Beaumont did not come back. Evelyn did not leave. She had Burl Tatum and his nephew repair the remaining roof sections. She sealed the loft floor. She had the millstone examined by a millwright from Knoxville, who said one half was salvageable, and offered to restore the mechanism for what Evelyn could afford, which was not much, but he did it anyway because, he said, working gristmills were rarer than most people realized and worth preserving for their own sake. She applied for a small business grant through the county and used it to restore the overshot wheel. The first time water ran through the wheel race again, and the wheel turned, slowly, creaking, improbable. Evelyn stood on the bank of Sycamore Creek and did not know whether to laugh or cry, so she did both. She opened the mill as a working heritage site the following October. Not a resort, not a spa. A mill doing what a mill was built to do, grinding cornmeal and grits and whole wheat flour on the old stone the way it had been done for 100 years. She took school groups. She hosted workshops on Appalachian food preservation. She ran a small farm stand on Saturdays, where she sold what she grew in the kitchen garden she had planted along the south wall, in a spot that got good afternoon light, with a sign that said, Hester Renfrew grew this same garden. She fed this hollow for 18 years. We're keeping the tradition. She taught herself to keep bees. It took 2 full seasons and a lot of stings to do it right, but she learned. She found all of the families she could, the ones in the composition books and the ledger. She wrote letters, actual letters on paper because that felt right, telling them what she had found and what she was trying to do. She set up a small archive room in the loft, accessible to researchers and to anyone from the hollow whose family appeared in Hester's records. People came. A woman from Knoxville whose grandmother was Berta Kinlaw, the one who had tried to pay Hester with an embroidered handkerchief. A retired teacher from Maryville, whose great-uncle was one of the Sutherland children Hester had carried food to up the Ridge Road in the winter of 1955. A man in his 70s named Grover Cogswell, who had grown up in the hollow and remembered, just barely, being a small child and his mother taking him up to the mill, and a tall woman with dark hair giving him a piece of cornbread and not asking for anything in return. That summer, exactly 50 years after Hester Renfrew had died, Evelyn held a gathering at the mill. She put notices in the county paper and on the town Facebook page and sent letters to everyone she had found. She expected perhaps 20 people, knowing that 50 years was a long time, and most of the people who had known Hester directly were gone. 91 people came. They came from 3 states. They came in pickup trucks and Subarus, and one woman came in a church van, because she had organized a group from her congregation in Chattanooga who had no direct connection to Hester, but had heard the story and felt they needed to be there. The oldest person at the gathering was 87, a woman named Iris Story, whose mother had been a neighbor of the Renfrews when Iris was a child. Iris did not remember Hester herself, but she remembered her mother speaking of her. She was the kind of person, Iris said, sitting in a folding chair in the mill yard with a paper cup of sweet tea, who made you want to be better than you were, and she never said a word about it. That was the thing. She never said a word about it. They told stories in the mill yard while the wheel turned in the creek and the September light came down through the hardwoods and fell golden on the stone walls. They sang a hymn that Evelyn hadn't known, but that several of the older people knew by heart, one of the old shape note songs from the sacred harp tradition. 4-part harmony rising up out of the hollow without any accompaniment, the sound of it moving over the water and up the ridge. Evelyn stood at the mill door with her notebook. She had always kept a notebook, 30 years of notebooks, full of things she didn't want to forget. And she understood something that she had been moving toward without knowing it for her entire life. Her grandmother Nell had been born in Sycamore Bend. Nell had ground her family's corn at this mill as a child. Nell had known the Renfrew family. Nell had told Evelyn's mother stories about Sycamore Bend, and Evelyn's mother had told Evelyn, though the stories had grown abbreviated over the generations the way all inherited stories do, losing their specifics and keeping only their feeling. What Evelyn had carried all her life, The instinct to put things up in jars, to note what a person needed without being asked, to forgive a debt when the person couldn't pay. She had learned from her mother, who had learned it from Nell, who had learned it, perhaps, from watching a woman at a mill on a creek road in a hollow called Sycamore Bend. She had not recognized it until now. She had spent 29 years in a marriage that slowly, quietly, year by year, asked her to be smaller than she was. She had spent those years not understanding why she kept doing the things she did. The extra casseroles she brought to neighbors who hadn't asked. The $20 bills she tucked into cards for students when she did the volunteer tutoring at the public library. The phone calls she made on the first cold night of every winter to 3 women on her street who lived alone and might need someone to check on the furnace. She had done all of it without a name for it. She had done it the way you breathe, because it was simply what the body does. Now she had a name for it. It was called Hester Renfrew. Evelyn never went back to Bowling Green. She lived in the room above the loft, the one with the iron bed frame and the wood stove, and the window that looked out over the creek. She had bought a proper mattress and a good lamp, and she had lined the windowsill with small plants that did well in the morning light. She walked down to the mill each morning the way Hester had walked down from the same room to the same stones for 18 years. She was not lonely. She was, for the first time in a very long time, precisely where she was supposed to be. Some lives only finish their meaning when somebody else takes them up. Hester Renfrew had worked in that hollow for 18 years and had never once asked to be remembered. She had asked, apparently, for nothing except to be useful, which is a form of asking that the world does not always know how to answer. But it had been answered. It had been answered by a woman who drove into a hollow 50 years later with $2,847 and a cracked taillight and nothing left to lose, and who bent down and picked up what Hester had set down, and who kept going. That is what legacy looks like when no one is advertising it. It looks like a mason jar with a handwritten label sitting on a shelf in the dark for 60 years, waiting for someone to pick it up and read the name of who it was for. If this story reached something in you tonight, please subscribe to Grand Stories and share this with someone who needs to hear it. And we want to know, who in your life gave quietly without keeping count, without asking to be remembered? Leave their name in the comments. Say thank you, even now. Even if they're gone. Especially if they're gone, they'll hear it. We'll see you in the next one.